Betty Broderick quietly entered her ex-husband Dan's bedroom at 5:30 a.m. on November 5, 1989, carrying a .38 caliber revolver and 20 years of marriage's worth of revenge in her heart. When she saw the sleeping couple in bed, she pulled the trigger. 2 bullets, 2 deaths. This is how 20 years of love transformed into hatred reached its final act. This is the story of one of America's most talked about crimes of passion. A fairy tale beginning. When Betty Ann Bisceglia met law student Dan Broderick at Notre Dame University in 1969, she thought she had found the love of her life. Betty was beautiful, intelligent, and ambitious. Dan was handsome, charismatic, and a promising law student. Both came from Catholic families and held traditional values. When they married in 1972, Betty was only 22 and Dan was 26. Their wedding was held at one of San Diego's most prestigious churches, and the young couple spent their honeymoon in Hawaii. Betty began working to support Dan's education. While she worked as a flight attendant for an airline, Dan continued his studies at Harvard Law School. The early years truly were like a fairy tale. Betty had given up her own dreams to support Dan's career. After Dan graduated from Harvard, they returned to San Diego, and Dan started working at a prestigious law firm. Betty focused on being a housewife and raising children. Their first child, Kim, was born in 1976. Then came Lee, 1977, Daniel Jr., 1979, and Rhett, 1981. While Betty was busy with 4 children, Dan was rapidly advancing in his career. Specializing in medical malpractice cases, Dan quickly became one of San Diego's most successful lawyers. In the early 1980s, the Broderick family bought a large house in Coral Reef, one of San Diego's most prestigious neighborhoods. The house had an ocean view and cost an astronomical $650,000 at the time. Betty spent months decorating the house. She carefully designed each room, bought antique furniture, and had the garden landscaped by a professional. From the outside, the Broderick family was the perfect example of the American dream. A handsome and successful father, a beautiful and devoted mother, 4 healthy children, and a luxurious lifestyle. Betty paid great attention to maintaining the perfect family image, even in the pre-social media era. They threw parties, went on vacations, and chose the best schools for their children's education. Cracks begin to show. When Linda Kolkena entered Dan's life in 1983, Betty initially didn't realize this was a threat. Linda was 21 years old, tall, blonde, and very beautiful. While working as a flight attendant for Delta Airlines, she applied to Dan's law firm as an assistant, seeking better opportunities. Linda was a flight attendant with no legal experience, but Dan hired her anyway. Although Betty found this suspicious, she didn't worry, thinking Linda was young and inexperienced. However, Dan's working hours began to get longer. He came home late in the evenings and said he had to work at the office on weekends. Betty began to notice changes in her husband. Dan wasn't as warm and affectionate as before. He acted distant toward her and became impatient in their conversations. He didn't participate in family activities as much as before, constantly finding work excuses instead of spending time with the children. In the fall of 1983, Betty found a reservation slip in Dan's briefcase. Dan had made a reservation at a luxury hotel in Beverly Hills with Linda. When Betty confronted Dan about this slip, Dan claimed it was a work-related meeting, but Betty's suspicions had grown. The next month, while checking Dan's credit card statement, Betty was shocked. Dan had bought expensive jewelry, clothes, and flowers for Linda. The total spending was $15,000. This time her argument with Dan was much more heated. Dan claimed these were business gifts, but Betty had learned the truth. The beginning of psychological warfare. When Betty definitively learned about Dan and Linda's relationship in early 1984, she entered the darkest period of her life. She felt that her 20-year marriage had collapsed overnight. As a mother of 4 children, she felt betrayed and humiliated, while also worrying about her future. Betty initially tried to convince Dan to save their marriage. She suggested going to couples therapy and proposed taking a family vacation, but Dan was now determined to get out of this marriage. Although he didn't tell Betty openly, his behavior made it clear he wanted to end the marriage. Dan's attitude drove Betty even more crazy. Dan acted as if nothing had happened and continued to deny his relationship with Linda. He got angry at Betty's questions and accused her of being paranoid and unstable. This fueled Betty's anger. Betty decided to take revenge. As her first move, she took Dan's clothes out to the garden and poured detergent over them. Expensive suits, ties, and shoes became unusable. When Dan came home and saw the scene, he went crazy with anger, but Betty didn't care. The next step was more extreme. Betty began destroying Dan's beloved antique collection. She broke crystal vases, tore valuable paintings, and threw collection pieces in the trash. With each piece she destroyed, she thought she was reflecting the pain Dan had caused her. When Dan couldn't stand this situation anymore, he decided to live separately. In early 1985, he moved out of the house and began living with Linda. When Betty was left alone, her anger increased even more. Now she wanted revenge not only on Dan, but also on Linda. Escalating threats and harassment. After Dan moved out of the house, Betty's behavior became increasingly dangerous. Every night she would call Dan's new address and leave threatening messages. Initially, she would just yell and curse, but over time, her threats became more concrete. "I'm going to kill you, Dan Broderick," she screamed in one voice recording that made it into police archives. "You and that whore will burn in hell together." She would leave such messages 20 to 30 times a week. Dan initially didn't take these threats seriously, but as he saw Betty's determination, he began to worry. Betty also began calling Linda at work. When Linda answered the phone, she would breathe silently, sometimes curse, and sometimes say, "I'll find you." Linda was very scared of this situation and told her friends she was afraid to come to work. One of her most extreme behaviors occurred in the fall of 1985. Betty had learned the address of Dan's new house and went to the front of the house with her car at night. While Dan and Linda were sleeping inside, Betty waited in the garden. When Dan left for work in the morning, Betty followed him with her car. This situation continued for weeks. When Dan finally understood the seriousness of the situation, he got a restraining order against Betty. Legally, Betty could not come within 100 meters of Dan, but this order had no effect on Betty. On the contrary, it drove her even more crazy. "You kicked me out of my own house. Now you want me to stay away from you," she screamed in one phone recording. "This won't end like this, Dan. This will never end." The custody battle. When Dan filed for divorce in 1986, Betty's world completely collapsed. Dan wasn't just getting out of the marriage. He was also trying to get custody of the children. For Betty, this was the final blow. The children were the meaning of her life, and she couldn't imagine losing them. Dan argued that custody should be with him for the children's safety, citing Betty's unstable behavior. He presented Betty's threatening messages, stalking incidents, and aggressive behavior as evidence to the court. Betty hired her own lawyer, but she was in a difficult position against Dan's legal knowledge and connections. Dan was one of San Diego's most recognized lawyers and knew most of the judges. Betty was seen only as an angry woman. During the court process, Betty's psychological condition worsened even more. The fear of losing her children was driving her crazy. She couldn't sleep at night, couldn't eat, and cried constantly. Her friends suggested she get psychological help, but Betty refused. In 1987, the court awarded custody of the children to Dan. Betty only got supervised visitation rights on weekends. This decision was the final blow for Betty. Now she had lost not only her husband, but also her children. "He deprived me of everything," reads one of her diary entries. "My home, my husband, my children. What's left? Only hatred." The final blow, Dan and Linda's wedding. When Dan and Linda married in April 1989, Betty's last thread of patience completely snapped. The wedding was held at one of San Diego's most prestigious churches, with 200 people from the city's high society attending. When Betty learned about this wedding from the newspaper, she completely lost control. That day, Betty called Dan 47 times. She was angrier with each call. "You'll regret marrying that whore," she screamed in voice recordings that still exist in police archives. "This marriage won't last long, I guarantee that." Dan was now really afraid of Betty. He filed a complaint with the police and strengthened the home security system. Linda also requested a security guard at work. Both were wondering if Betty had a gun. Betty's behavior was no longer limited to just threats. She would throw stones when passing by Dan's house and cut his car tires. Once she had broken Dan's car windshield with a baseball bat. Police would warn Betty each time, but they wouldn't arrest her. In October, Betty prepared a new action plan. She still couldn't get Dan's house key because the security system had been changed. However, Betty managed to get a duplicate key copy from Dan's cleaning lady. Now she could enter Dan's house whenever she wanted. The Bloody Morning, November 5th, 1989. On Saturday night, November 5th, 1989, Betty couldn't sleep. In her mind, Dan and Linda's happy marriage dreams kept spinning, and this situation was driving her crazy. After midnight, she got in her car and headed toward Dan's house. When she arrived in front of Dan's house at 2 a.m., all the lights were off. The couple was sleeping. Betty waited in the car for an hour, thinking about what to do. Then she took out her .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver from her purse. She had bought this gun 2 months earlier for protection. At 3:30 a.m., she got out of the car. She quietly passed through the garden and entered the house through the back door. The security system was off at this hour because she knew Dan had a habit of getting up at night to use the bathroom. Betty's heartbeat echoed in her ears as she climbed the stairs. The bedroom door was ajar. When Betty looked inside, she saw Dan and Linda sleeping side by side. Linda was sleeping on the side where Betty had slept for 20 years. This detail drove Betty even more crazy. Both were in deep sleep. Dan was lying on his back and Linda was leaning against Dan. Betty would later describe that moment like this: "When I saw them, 20 years of pain came back to me all at once. This woman stole my life." Betty raised the gun and pulled the trigger. The first bullet hit Linda. The young woman woke up and started screaming. Dan also woke up and tried to understand what was happening. Betty fired her second bullet toward Dan. Although Dan was wounded, he tried to get out of bed. "Betty, stop!" he shouted. But Betty fired her third bullet too. This time Dan was shot in the chest and collapsed to the floor. Linda had died with the first bullet. Betty dropped the gun and left the room. As she went down the stairs, she felt nothing. It was as if she was dreaming. She got in her car and went home. At home, she took a shower, put on clean clothes, and made coffee. Then she called the police. Investigation and arrest. Betty called the San Diego Police Department at 7:20 a.m. to turn herself in. "My name is Betty Broderick. I killed my ex-husband, Dan Broderick. Come get me." The police officer initially thought it was a joke. "Ma'am, this is a serious accusation. Did you really commit a murder?" Yes, Betty said in a calm voice. Dan Broderick and his wife Linda. I killed both of them. I'm waiting at Balboa Park. Police teams were immediately sent to the scene. They encountered a horrific scene at Dan's house. Dan was found dead next to the bedroom, and Linda was found dead in the bed. Both had gunshot wounds. The crime scene investigation team found Betty's fingerprints on door handles and stair railings. There were 3 empty shell casings in the bedroom. The gun couldn't be found, but Betty had brought the gun with her when she turned herself in to police. Betty was surprisingly calm when arrested. In her police statement, she described the incident in detail. She showed no signs of remorse. They destroyed my life, she said. I ended theirs. When police searched Betty's house, they found notes she had kept about Dan and Linda. These notes contained detailed plans to kill them. A list titled Ways to Kill D and L contained different scenarios. Trial process and verdict. Betty Broderick's trial began in 1990 and became one of America's most talked about cases. Betty was charged with 2 separate counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution claimed it was premeditated murder. Betty's defense strategy was based on temporary insanity. Her lawyers argued that Betty had lost control that night as a result of years of psychological pressure, 20 years of marriage, adultery, losing her children, and financial difficulties had destabilized Betty. However, the prosecution presented Betty's notes and her prior gun purchase as evidence of planned murder. Betty's threatening messages and stalking incidents were also considered evidence of premeditation. The first trial was canceled because the jury couldn't reach a decision. The second trial began in 1991. This time, the jury found Betty guilty of 2 separate counts of second-degree murder. Betty was sentenced to 30 years in prison, 15 years for each count. When passing sentence, the judge said, Betty Broderick tried to solve problems she couldn't resolve through legal means with violence. This is unacceptable. She ended the lives of 2 innocent people. Betty was in tears when she received her sentence. Justice has been served, she said, but real justice would have been when Dan was alive. Epilogue. Betty Broderick applied for parole in 2010, but it was denied. Her second parole application in 2017 was also denied. She is still imprisoned at California Women's Facility. Betty, who is 77 years old in 2025, has her next parole hearing in 2032. After Dan and Linda's deaths, the Broderick children lived with their grandparents. All 4 grew up and built their own lives. They have limited contact with their mother. This case went down in history as a bitter example of how love can turn to hatred, and that revenge solves no problems. Betty Broderick's story inspired television movies, books, and documentaries, because this is not just a murder story, but also an analysis of the dark side of human psychology.